During the Battle of Lead Gulf, Task Unit Taffy 3 made an incredible stand against overwhelming odds, holding off a formidable Japanese task group. Rear Admiral Clifton A.S. Sprague received a telegram from one of his pilots on anti-submarine patrol on October 25, 1944, at precisely 6:45 in the morning. The message reported an enemy surface force consisting of 4 battleships, 7 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, located 20 miles northwest of his task group and closing in at 39 knots. Admiral Sprague, often known as Z, found the message annoying, believing it to be a case of mistaken identity. He thought it likely that the reported enemy force was actually part of Admiral William Halsey's fast battleship group. However, Halsey's Third Fleet was much further north. After yelling into the squawk box to have the pilot check his identification, Sprague returned to work. His 6 escort carriers had been flying support strikes for recent landings on the Philippine island of Leyte for the past 8 days. They were covered by 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts, officially known as Task Unit 77.43 but commonly referred to as Taffy 3. Sprague had another busy day of airstrikes and patrols planned. Taffy 3 was operating just east of Samar Island when the pilot who initially reported the enemy sighting sent another message 3 minutes later, confirming the identification of the enemy force. He noted the distinctive pagoda masts on the ships and saw anti-aircraft puffs emerging to the northwest. The pilot had just dropped his cargo on an enemy cruiser, confirming that the force was indeed Japanese. The Japanese force was the center segment of a 3-pronged assault against the American landing beach at Lead Gulf. It consisted of 2 light cruisers, 6 heavy cruisers, 4 battleships, and 11 destroyers, and had been struck by air raids the previous day in the Sablayan Sea by Halsey's Third Fleet. Despite sustaining damage, including the sinking of the battleship Musashi, the Japanese force continued its advance. Sprague's lookouts visually confirmed the approaching warships were Japanese shortly after the pilot's report. The distinctive superstructures of Japanese cruisers and battleships appeared over the northwest horizon, and the ships began firing at 6:58. Colored splashes from Japanese shells fell astern of Taffy 3, signaling the start of the engagement. Taffy 3's force included 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, Street Low, White Plains, Kitkun Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. The largest armament among these ships was the 5-inch guns on the destroyers and destroyer escorts, as well as a single 5-inch cannon on each escort carrier. This was no match for the Japanese force, which included the massive battleship Yamato with its 18-inch guns. Sprague did not expect his small force to hold out against the approaching battleships and cruisers for more than 15 minutes. Nevertheless, he ordered a change in course from north to due east, directing Taffy 3 at full speed toward a friendly rain squall nearby. This maneuver also turned his carriers into the wind, allowing them to launch aircraft for torpedo and bombing attacks against the Japanese force. He ordered smoke screens to shield Taffy 3 from the Japanese gunners and initiated a rapid series of defensive actions. The carriers launched their planes, starting with Fanshawe Bay's complement of Grumman TB-F Avengers. White Plains followed with Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters and bomb-carrying Avengers. Meanwhile, the Japanese commander, Admiral Kurita, was equally shocked when his lookouts aboard Yamato first noticed the American ships. Mistaking the escort carriers for fleet carriers, Kurita ordered his force to deploy for a general attack, leading to confusion and a lack of coordination. Sprague, unaware of Kurita's confusion, issued an urgent plea for help. Admiral Thomas Stump, commander of Taffy 2, which was approximately 30 miles away, replied immediately. Aircraft from Taffy 1, about 70 miles away, were also sent by Admiral Thomas Sprague, unrelated to Z. Sprague. Admiral Stump encouraged his friend over the TBS, talk between ships, urging him to stay calm and not to do anything rash. The Avengers launched their attacks individually or in small groups, unable to assemble in time for a coordinated assault. Despite the odds, Taffy 3's desperate defense and the confusion among the Japanese force contributed to a remarkable stand in naval history. The Avengers made their passes without the assistance of striking fighters to cause disruption. Whether they were carrying bombs or torpedoes, almost all of Taffy 3's operational aircraft had taken to the air by 7:30. One of the first Japanese warships to be attacked was the heavy cruiser Suzuya. Admiral Kurita's center force was the target of all aircraft in the Elite Gulf area, and Suzuya was struck, slowing down by 8:30. 20 fighters and 6 Avengers equipped with torpedoes started an attack, accompanied by planes that had already taken off from the escort carriers. However, these aircraft were launched and armed in a rush, leaving little time to organize their maneuvers. They continued to strike aggressively until the torpedo supply ran out. Most of the Avengers were initially equipped with torpedoes, but once those were depleted, they switched to various explosives, including 100-pound all-purpose bombs meant for small land targets. The pilots conducted dry runs on the opposing ships after dropping their bombs to divert the Japanese gunners. 2 hours after dropping his bombs, the leader of the air group in Commander Bay flew his Avenger through hostile flak. When their ammunition ran out, the fighter pilots turned to conducting dry runs to harass the enemy. The pilots of the Wildcat fighters were dispatched to strafe, hoping to kill personnel on the Japanese warships, silence automatic weapons, and most importantly, draw attention away from the struggling escort carriers. 10 of the 20 strafing runs were made by one pilot without ammo for 20 minutes. 5 aircraft from the air group of Commander Bay circled the Japanese fleet, attempting to find a gap in the clouds that would allow them to make their runs on the larger ships. The pilots watched a squad of Avengers and Wildcats pursuing the battleships while they waited for their opportunity. The flight leader noted that the attacks were executed with great skill. However, there weren't enough planes, and the Avengers' bomb loads were frequently too light and too varied to cause significant harm. This assessment was not shared by Japanese officers. After the war, a Japanese officer told his American interpreter that the attack was the most skillful work of American planes they had experienced, noting the bombers and torpedo planes were very aggressive and coordinated impressively. Admiral Sprague sent his destroyers and destroyer escorts against Kurita's force in addition to his carrier air groups. These screening warships, usually tasked with guarding the escort carriers from submarines, were suddenly doing something entirely different. The Fletcher-class destroyer Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, opened fire at 7:10, hitting the Japanese cruiser Kumano. Johnston fired around 200 shots at the cruiser, hitting it multiple times. The Japanese ships opened fire again, their mass salvos bursting in 4 or 5 different colors around the destroyer. The Ford Mark I fire control computer and the radar-controlled Mark 37 fire control system gave American warships a clear advantage in gunnery despite the Japanese warships' better range. Johnston's gunners were able to hit their target multiple times thanks to the effective shooting solutions provided by the radar-directed system for her 5-inch guns. Evans also ordered a torpedo attack. Sprague had given the order for all 3 destroyers to launch torpedo attacks, with Johnston leading Heermann and Hull into battle. Johnston launched her attack first, getting as close as 10,000 yards to Kumano. 10 of her torpedoes were fired, and they were seen to run hot, straight, and normal. Evans changed direction and retired behind a smokescreen after all the torpedoes had been fired. About a minute later, Kumano emerged from the cloud, her stern section burning fiercely. 2 or 3 heavy underwater explosions were heard, suggesting multiple hits. However, Kurita later admitted to only one hit by an American destroyer. Kumano gave up the battle, and the heavily damaged Suzuya also retreated at 20 knots. Johnston was hit by 14-inch and 6-inch shells around 7:30, completely destroying the after fire room and engine room. The 3 after 5-inch guns and the steering engine lost all power, and the gyro compass was rendered inoperable. The ship slowed to 17 knots. 3 crew members were killed when the radar antenna broke off and crashed onto the bridge. Evans lost 2 fingers on his left hand and all his clothing above the waist in the blast. Despite numerous casualties below decks, the destroyer did not sink, and when the bridge asked, every station responded. A rain squall passing over Johnston allowed her crew about 10 minutes to patch up some of the damage. Japanese gunners, relying on optical rangefinders, found their shots usually useless when smoke clouds or rain obscured their targets. In a short while, 3 of Johnston's 5-inch guns were operational again. The warship Congo was Hull's intended target at a distance of 14,000 yards. Commander Leon S. Kittberger, the captain of Hull, opened fire on the enemy battleship. Congo retaliated, striking Hull's bridge and severing all radio and phone communication. Hull opened fire on the battleship with her 5-inch guns 2 minutes later, and then launched a half-salvo of 5 torpedoes. Congo turned sharply to the left at 7:33, just in time to evade the torpedoes. Although American torpedoes were slow and could be readily dodged, the evasive maneuver confused the Japanese warships and slowed their advance. Admiral Kurita himself acknowledged that he was losing more tactical control each time his ships had to turn to escape Taffy 3's torpedoes, saying that major units were separating constantly due to the destroyer torpedo attacks. A number of large-caliber shells struck Hull as her torpedoes were still running their course. 3 cannons and the destroyer's port engine were destroyed, and the rudder was jammed hard to the right. Before Hull could bring her rudder amidships, she was sailing directly toward Congo. Her number 1 and 2 guns kept firing at targets of opportunity while steering was adjusted. Despite the destroyer's severe damage, Kittberger remained in the fight. The heavy cruiser Haguro, the first ship in the straggling cruiser column, was the target of his remaining torpedoes. Japanese archives do not indicate any hits from Hull's torpedoes, but large columns of water were observed to rise from the cruiser at the scheduled time for the torpedo run. Following the final firing of his torpedoes, Kittberger made every effort to retreat to the southwest, away from the enemy's heavy artillery. The battleship Congo was barely 8,000 yards off his port beam, and heavy cruisers were only 7,000 yards off his starboard quarter. Hull, with only 1 engine, was trapped and lacked the speed to escape. According to one source, every Japanese ship within range took a shot at her. Hull spent more than an hour zigzagging while her 2 bow guns fired almost 500 rounds of 5-inch ammo toward the most menacing-looking enemy ships. She also took more than 40 hits. At the same time, including 5-inch, 8-inch, and even 16-inch ones, some of the armor-piercing shells passed through without detonating. However, the destroyer was hit by numerous unexploded shells, several of which were below the waterline. Hull's crew was able to witness the Japanese heavy cruiser's anti-aircraft gunners in action when they went by at a sufficiently close distance. By 8:30, Hull was dead in the water when an 8-inch shell destroyed the last of her engine. The ship started to flood and list at the stern while several crew members stayed behind to ensure there would be no explosion. Kittberger saw no other option but to issue the order to prepare to abandon ship. One magazine caught fire as the destroyer was being towed away. Finally, at 8:55, after every man had abandoned ship, Hull capsized and sank. She was fired upon by Japanese ships to the very end. Heermann, the final of the 3 American destroyers, was not informed to follow Hull and Johnston into the torpedo strike. She was preoccupied with inspecting the escort carriers and failed to receive the notification. At 7:50, the order was finally received, and Heermann charged through the remaining carrier formation at full speed. Due to the smoke and rain, visibility was not optimal. Commander Amos T. Hathaway, the commander of the destroyer, had a lot on his plate. Hathaway had to send his engine room into emergency astern twice to prevent a collision. As it transpired, Hull and the destroyer escorting Samuel B. Roberts were barely missed by Heermann. Hathaway avoided all friendly ships in the area before reversing course and advancing toward the closest enemy warship, the massive cruiser Haguro. At 7:54, Heermann fired 7 torpedoes and started firing her 5-inch guns at the cruiser. The torpedoman had intended to fire just 5 torpedoes in the attack, but intentionally fired 2 more. After evading every torpedo, Haguro started shooting at Heermann. Every volley fired by the cruiser failed to hit its target. After unleashing his torpedoes, Hathaway turned his back on Haguro and headed toward Kongo and Haruna. Yamato and Nagato, the fourth Japanese battleship, were positioned behind these two warships. There seemed to be hostile battleships everywhere, but Hathaway felt that more enemy warships meant more targets. He moved his 5-inch guns to the cruiser Chikuma and swung to course 270 to get into firing position for the remaining torpedoes. Hirman was being targeted by Kongo, Nagato, and Yamato while he held Chikuma at bay. Shell splashes of red, yellow, and green exploded around her, yet nothing bigger than shell fragments struck her. Hirman moved to within 4,400 yards of Haruna after dodging the battleship's heavy fire. Hathaway fired his last 3 torpedoes into Haruna at 8 o'clock a.m., then detached himself using his 5-inch batteries. Within a few minutes, at 7:50, when Hathaway started his fast dash past Taffy 3's escort carriers, and at 8:03 when he turned away from Haruna, all of this frenzied activity took place. Hirman had a fortunate 13 minutes, escaping enemy gunfire while being the target of multiple Japanese warships. According to Hirman's action report, one of her torpedoes struck Haruna, while 2 missed their target and went toward Yamato, possibly accompanied by 2 torpedoes that Hull had fired at another Japanese ship. Yamato turned away and continued northward. For about 10 minutes, Yamato was essentially removed from the battle. At the height of the conflict, Kurita had lost both his largest battleship and what should have been his most potent gun platform. He began to believe he was up against more than a few destroyers and escort carriers. He was up against a significant American task force. However, the fight was far from lost. Little wolves, form up for a second attack. Sprague yelled to his destroyer escorts as they started to run for Kurita's vessels. Around the same moment that Hull was firing her torpedoes at Haguro, the radio call sign for the destroyer escorts was Little Wolves, and Wolves was code for the destroyers. Until now, the destroyer escorts had been committed almost entirely to anti-submarine missions. For the Little Wolves of Taffy 3, torpedo attacks against cruisers and battleships were a novel experience. They gave the work their all. Raymond faced the top Japanese cruiser Haguro. She fired 3 torpedoes at a distance of roughly 6,000 yards just before 8 o'clock a.m. Haguro turned to avoid them, and Raymond made a hasty course adjustment to leave the situation as soon as possible. Dennis took the same action, veering hard to the southwest after firing her torpedoes at the closest Japanese cruiser, probably Tome or Chokai. Dennis used her after 5-inch battery to commence fire on a ship that was already under air attack. At around 8:10, following a 7-minute gunfight with the cruiser, Dennis quickly wheeled off toward the southwest. All of the Little Wolves turned around and went southwest as soon as they launched their torpedo attacks, shooting their 5-inch cannons and producing smoke at the closest enemy vessel. Considering that all the small ships were twisting and turning to evade enemy salvos, it is almost unbelievable that none were struck by enemy gunfire or collided. No one with any comprehensive understanding of what was happening was on either side. The weather made matters worse, with clouds and rain occasionally completely obscuring the view. Visibility was further reduced by smoke from the destroyers, destroyer escorts, and escort carriers. The Japanese officers were still mostly unaware of the situation. Taffy 3's escort carriers were initially thought to be part of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet. They were recognized as Japanese carriers by some lookouts. Some claimed to have seen battleships and cruisers. Tone and Haguro both claimed to have fired on a heavy cruiser, which was actually the Johnston, and Haguro had fired on a destroyer, which was actually the Raymond. The American escort vessels started to receive strikes from Japanese gunners. Tone gave Dennis a direct blow at around 8:50. The main deck was penetrated by the shell, which exited the starboard side approximately 3 feet above the waterline. A second blow knocked out her 40mm gun director 10 minutes later, and a third hit her No. 1 5-inch gun shield, rendering the gun unusable. The destroyer escort changed her heading to 220 and withdrew to the southwest, having already lost her No. 2 gun due to mechanical issues. Around the same time, Samuel B. Roberts took 3 more strikes in quick succession. Her skipper, Commander Robert W. Copeland, reported a tremendous explosion at approximately 9:00 a.m., attributed to Congo firing two 14-inch shells on the port side of the destroyer Escort exactly at the waterline. The explosion created a long, jagged hole that was 30 or 40 feet long and roughly 7 to 10 feet high. It destroyed the No.2 engine room, blew up the after fuel tanks, and lit the fantail on fire. At 10:05, the order to leave ship was issued, and Samuel B. Roberts capsized and sank. 3 officers and 86 men out of her crew of 170 men and 8 officers were killed, reported missing, or passed away from injuries. For roughly 30 minutes, Gambier Bay was able to outmaneuver everything the Japanese threw at her. Every time a hostile salvo dropped, the carrier altered its trajectory, confusing and forcing enemy gunners to retarget. The distance between Gambier Bay and the enemy cruisers shrank from 17,000 yards to 10,000 yards between 7:41 and 8:10. The escort carrier took her first hit at 8:10, igniting flames in the hangars and on the flight deck. She continued to take hits after that. Due to a hole in the forward port engine room below the waterline that flooded the forward areas, the engine room had to be abandoned. The ship fell astern of the remaining group and slowed to 11 knots. It was around this time when Johnston rejoined the fight. Upon observing the state of Gambier Bay, Commander Evans instructed his gunnery officer to open fire on the closest cruiser, Chikuma. He thought of a strategy to deflect her fire from the escort carrier. The gunnery officer for Johnston stated, "We closed to 6,000 and scored 5 hits, but the strategy was unsuccessful." Chikuma continued shooting toward Gambier Bay, ignoring the warship. Chikuma's focus on the escort ship seemed foolish to Johnston's gunnery officer. "He might have sunk both of us." Her men tried everything to divert Chikuma's attention, but she was likewise unsuccessful. The heavy cruiser struck the destroyer and managed to transfer part of her fire to Kitkun Bay, but Gambier Bay remained her main objective. The carrier's engine room flooded, the steering was incapacitated, and radar was rendered inoperable. Gambier Bay was sinking and lifeless in the water by 8:45. The order to leave ship was delivered 5 minutes later. Up to the carrier's final capsize and sinking at 9:07, sailors were being killed by shell fragments fired by Chikuma and another cruiser. Johnston's attention was drawn to Japanese destroyers preparing to strike the escort carriers after Gambier Bay sank. When the destroyers were still over 10,000 yards away, they were sighted. Johnston fired first at the leader, which turned out to be the light cruiser Yahaji. According to one report, the adversary fired straight back, hitting Johnston multiple times. After Johnston struck at Hachi almost a dozen times, the cruiser veered 90 degrees to starboard to position itself to fire torpedoes. At 9:55, Yahachi fired 7 torpedoes, and shortly afterward, the Japanese warships started their launch. The target was too far away from them. Kitkun Bay, the closest carrier, was 10,500 yards away. The squadron commander was shaken by Johnston's relentless attack, which is why he decided to deploy torpedoes too soon. According to the Japanese action report, the strike caused 3 enemy carriers and 1 cruiser to be enveloped in black smoke and observed to sink one after the other. All this was wishful thinking. All the torpedoes missed, thus, in reality, they had no effect at all. One was deflected by a precise shot from Streetlow's 5-inch gun, or perhaps a lucky shot. One of Streetlow's Avengers used strafing to explode another. The others were sidestepped with their sprints towards the escort carriers, lasting an ample amount of time, and giving their targets the opportunity to move aside. Thus, a crippled destroyer that had used up all of her torpedoes and lost an engine was able to delay and unsettle a Japanese destroyer squadron. According to historian Samuel Eliot Morrison, Commander Evans, Johnston's captain, was utterly thrilled with his accomplishment. He laughed, "I've seen everything now." Evans, though, did not have much time to rejoice. The Japanese destroyer squadron targeted Johnston after firing its torpedoes. All power and communications were lost when what has been called an avalanche of shells struck the destroyer. The only weapon that could fire back was the manually operated No. 4 5-inch cannon. One of Johnston's officers recalled, "There were several destroyers on our starboard side, 2 cruisers on our port, and another dead ahead of us." At 9:40, Johnston went dead in the sea as the Japanese destroyers circled around her and fired at her like Indians attacking a prairie schooner. Evans issued the order to abandon ship 5 minutes later. A Japanese destroyer's captain saluted when his ship went down not long after 10:10. It was among the few bravery demonstrations that morning. There was some balance to the losses. 8 of the cruiser Chokai's long lance torpedoes detonated after it was struck by a 5-inch shell, possibly from White Plains. The cruiser's engines were damaged and her rudder was knocked out in the ensuing explosion, which caused her to slow down and break away from formation. The damage was completed by an Avenger's flight, which scored 3 hits on the bow, 1 hit and 2 near misses on the stern, and 5 bomb hits amidships. According to a report from Haguro, the heavy cruiser sank at 9:30, although one of the pilots saw her go about 500 yards, blow up, and sink within 5 minutes. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf, Task Unit 3, Taffy 3, made an incredible stand against overwhelming odds, holding off a formidable Japanese task group. Rear Admiral